Hey guys, so today we're just going to have a look at government intervention in the market. And we said that when we look at the labour market, one way which the government intervenes is through minimum wage. So we're going to just have a look at how that affects quantity demanded and quantity supplied today. Okay, so first of all, it's worth noting that in a free market, the wage rate will be determined by where quantity demanded equals quantity supplied. So we know that this is our market equilibrium from what we learned in demand and supply. So if there was no intervention in the market, that means it being a free market, we would see the wages being set at W1, which is determined by the market equilibrium, and the quantity being Q1, also determined by the market equilibrium. So that would be the wage rate. Okay, so let's say that the government set a minimum wage that's higher than the market wage of W1. So we'll call this W min or W. And when we look at what happens when W min is higher than W1, which is the wage that will be as a result of a free market, we can see that there is W min hits the demand curve here and it hits the supply curve over here. So now you can see our quantity demanded for labour has fallen because it's costing firms a higher price to higher than the W1, which was the free market wage. But there are more people willing to supply their labour, so our quantity supplied is higher, which means we have a labour excess of labour supply in the market. This is what we call market failure, and it's as a result of government intervention in the market. We could also see if W min was actually lower than the wage W1. So, for example, in times of economic upturn, we might see that the minimum wage is actually lower than what the free market wage would be. Well, then we would see that if, let's say, for example, it was somewhere about here, we would see that supply would be less, but demand would be more. So that would mean that firms would demand more labour because it's below the cost that they intended to pay labour, but supply would be less because people feel that it is not worthwhile supplying their labour. Okay, so just looking at a couple of reasons for wage rates being above the equilibrium rate, which was our free market wage rate. So first of all, trade unions will not allow rates to fall in reaction to market changes. So when we see that there are times of economic downturn, which means that demand is less than supply in any market, then trade unions will not allow for the government to, or for firms to lower the wages in response. Okay, so we've talked about that before. We've said that often the way firms deal with that is that they may decide to introduce voluntary redundancies, and then as they introduce voluntary redundancies, they can then take on new labour at lower contracts. In order to ensure industrial peace, the government and social partners, so one of the social partners that's involved is ICTU, the Irish Congress of Trade Unions, and IBEC, the Irish Business Employers Federation, have entered into national wage agreements, and each of these resulted in wage increases, and we saw a recent wage increase up to 1010. As part of the above agreement, social welfare benefits have also increased, therefore employers have to increase higher wages. Remember, we said that if social welfare benefits are higher than the minimum wage, people will see that it's not worthwhile for them to work and prefer to go on social welfare benefits. Also worth noting there as well that it's very important that the government makes sure that any loopholes can be closed to try and encourage people back into the labour force. So we talked about this during the at the end of the Celtic Tiger, at the beginning of the recession. We saw that the government introduced means testing, which means that they can look at all the different aspects of your life that might actually impact whether or not you should be on social welfare benefits. To compensate for inflation, many workers have sought wage increases. And then finally, economic rent due to a shortage of a particular skill can also be the reason for a wage rate being above the equilibrium rate. So just to run through the homework question that I had sent you, talking about factors that influence the supply of labour to the Irish economy. So the first thing that influences the supply of labour to the Irish economy will be wage levels within the economy, or that backward bending supply of labour. Remember that backward bending supply of labour also depends on consumer behaviour, or on the behaviour of workers. So higher wage levels act as an incentive for more people to supply their labour. As wage levels increase, they may prefer to increase leisure and reduce their supply of labour. Now remember, that does depend on the behaviour. So if it's something that in an economy that we're doing really, really well, and people feel that they can reduce their working hours and increase their leisure time, then that would be definitely that would definitely impact the supply of labour to the Irish economy. If we were in a country whereby they would see an increase in wages as an incentive to make more money, and would prefer to reduce their leisure time in order to make more money, then that backward bending supply curve would definitely change. It would definitely broaden. If we look here at the size and structure of the population, obviously has a huge effect. Remember, we talked about Iceland, the fact that they only have roughly about 450,000 people in their population. That means that their workforce is going to be very small, which may lead to the issues regarding inflation levels in Iceland. Participation rate has increased. So, for example, if we see that there are maybe even just more people coming in because of, for example, when we saw during the Celtic Tiger, and we also saw it in the last recession as well, that people started to enter the workforce who were previously kind of exited the workforce, for example, to stay home and mind kids. So maybe their kids are old enough now that they can go back into the workforce and work part-time hours. We've talked about the fact that the rates of income tax, or USC, can act as a deterrent. So that just means that it can put people off from working if they feel that their income tax, they're going to be paying too much. So for example, if they work so much that they push into that 40% income tax bracket, then they may decide to work less hours to come back out of it. Then you have labour mobility, which is a big one for Ireland because we're very lucky to be part of the EU. So the workforce in Ireland has become more occupationally mobile due to less barriers in place preventing the movement of workers. So the fact that in the EU we have free movement of labour, free movement of people, means that when we were during the Celtic Tiger, the economic upturn, when we had an excess demand for labour over supply, we saw a lot of workers from Eastern Europe come here to live. And then what we saw then during the recession was that when we had an excess supply over demand, we saw people leaving to go to Canada. We saw some people leaving to go to Eastern Europe, which had started to take up in terms of their economies, and maybe go there Monday to Friday and come home on Friday because the flights were so cheap and because they were earning enough money to do so. And then we also saw a lot of long-term emigration, so people going for a couple of years to Australia, Canada, New Zealand and so on. And finally then we have government regulation. So this means more means testing on those claiming benefits, the introduction of internships like JobsBridge. So that means testing comes in here again. When we talk about means testing, it could be something like looking at all of their finances. So for example, means testing applies now to people who are retired or over the age of 65. So they don't automatically give you your medical card, or they don't give you certain benefits immediately just because you are in that over 65 bracket. They actually means test you. So they look at your level of income, they look at any savings that you might have, they look at bank accounts and stuff like that to decide whether or not you could actually do without this benefit.